We only have maybe one more month of budget gaming PCs like this being possible, so I'm gonna show you everything you need to know. Because of the RAM, SSD, and now GPU shortage, the PC building market is in complete shambles, so pretty much all of my budget build guide videos are now out of date. I have been updating them recently though, and we were in desperate need of an ultra budget build guide for 2026. This entire system cost me just $300, and it played almost every game we threw at it in 1080p pretty well. Even if you don't wanna follow the aesthetic guide that my wife helped me with, that's totally fine. The important thing here is the performance, and for probably just a few weeks more, we can still get a high FPS per dollar value without breaking the bank. And real quickly, if you're new around here, my name is Zach, and I'm just trying to help you jump into gaming PCs any way you want to do it. I make a ton of build guide videos like this one. I have a bunch of totally free PC building resources on my website, and we also sell pre-builts if you just want to skip this entire process. I'm not trying to sway you one way or another. I just want to show you all of the options, like this $300 gaming PC for 2026. Let's go. All right, so what we're exploiting to make this whole thing possible is the fact that people selling OEM office desktops haven't updated their prices yet during the RAM shortage. Some of them have, don't get me wrong, but all it takes is one seller to not have updated prices for you to find a good deal. I scooped up this Dell Precision 3630 over on eBay for $155, and at that rate, that's the price of just the RAM that's inside of here. To go along with the Intel i5 8600 and 256 gig SSD, that's a 16 gig DDR4 kit, and that's all we need for a budget gaming PC to work. This PC isn't gonna be playing games nicely without a graphics card, obviously, but as long as you start with a good foundation like this one, all you have to do is add a GPU. Before we get to the GPU though, what makes a good foundation when you're buying an office desktop? The reason these are so cheap is because huge corporate companies save money by just throwing these away and then replacing them with new ones. The problem though is that some, or honestly most of these office PCs have terrible specs, so you can't just transform any of them into a gaming PC. There's 5 main points to look out for, which I'm about to explain, and as long as you follow this guide, it doesn't really matter which model you go with. Chances are that you won't find this exact Dell Precision 3630, but as long as you follow these steps, you'll be good to go. Number 1 these days is honestly the RAM, as you'd expect. A few years ago when I was doing this, I would consider starting with an 8 gig option and then just throwing another stick in there, but now since that one RAM stick costs the same as my mortgage, that's no longer an option. I mean, it still is, but that would completely defeat the purpose of a budget OEM desktop transformation. 16 gigabytes is the minimum these days for this type of project, and I don't care how low your budget is, I would not settle for anything less than that. I would also make sure that it's DDR4 and not settle for DDR3. That might be tempting, but these builds will certainly show their age with the newest titles. Number 2 is that you need a good CPU for gaming. Personally, I wouldn't go anywhere near these OEMs with a Xeon CPU or maybe an Intel i3. Get yourself at least an Intel i5 or ideally a Ryzen 5, because those are now out there for pretty cheap. For an i5, I wouldn't go anything lower than Intel 6th generation, but this 8th generation that I use is probably a good starting point for an ultra low budget build. The farther you go back, the harder it's gonna be to play the latest titles. This 8600 still has a little bit of life left in it, and it can pair with a good range of budget GPUs. And for Ryzen 5s, I see a lot of the 2000 series chips. That's about what I would search for, but whenever I was looking, I saw way more Intel i5s, so that's probably what you will find as well. Number 3 for things to look out for when buying these desktops is the storage, and I'd highly recommend trying to find one with an SSD. Just like RAM, the price of SSDs has skyrocketed, but those prices haven't been baked in yet, so this is where you can steal some more value. The one I found only had a 256 gig model, but that's enough for the operating system to be installed plus a few games. I did end up throwing in this WD Blue 1TB SATA SSD, which I had sitting on my shelf for like 2 years now. 256 gigabyte probably isn't enough for most people, so you'll want to add something additional, but it doesn't really matter what you go with, that'll be personal preference. Just remember that it's perfectly fine to have the fastest drive installed with Windows and then any combination of secondary drives for extra storage. You can mix and match this all you want as long as you have the right amount of M.2 or SATA ports and enough power connectors. And speaking of which, that's the number 4 thing to look out for, not just the power supply itself, but whatever the connectors are on it. Typically in these OEM office PCs, you'll find 3 to 500 watt PSUs that look like something you'd plant in Counter-Strike.
Bomb has been planted.
But honestly, most of them are pretty good with an 80 plus gold rating and a higher tier rating than you'd expect. Make sure it has enough wattage to supply whatever GPU you're thinking about going with, but also you need to make sure it has the right connectors. More often than not, it won't come with a 6-pin or 6+2 pin for the GPU, and that typically means you'll be limited to GPUs that don't require external power. These are cards like the GTX 1650 or even the RTX 3050. Those are good options for what they are, but there's a way to get more than that if you want to buy these dual SATA to 8-pin GPU power adapters. These are not necessarily the most respected item in the PC hardware market because honestly, it's just a tiny bit shady. I've used these a bunch of times without any issues, but any sort of power adapter isn't 100% necessarily safe. If you're gonna get one of these, I feel more comfortable using the dual SATA instead of just one, and as long as you aren't using this to power something like a 5080, I think it'll be perfectly fine. At my last IT job, I actually used those adapters to power a 3070, and I stress tested that thing for 24 continuous hours. I didn't have a problem with it at all. Using any adapter like this dramatically increases the range of GPUs that we can select from, so that's why I do it. But real quickly, the fifth and final thing to look out for with these office PCs is the form factor, so you can physically fit that GPU inside of there. Lots of these OEMs are super thin without the ability to install any GPU at all, and some of them are slightly bigger but can only fit a low profile or single slot card. When doing these types of projects, I always prefer to get these mid towers, which allow for a pretty much full-length GPU and at least 2 slots in width. We got lots of room for the types of GPUs that make sense in this sort of build, but also look out where the HDD cage will be. Sometimes they'll be exactly to the right of the PCIe slot, which means it'll block a longer sized graphics card. If you accidentally buy this, then you probably have to use a Dremel to get it out of there because they're usually not removable. So if you follow all 5 of those guidelines when picking an office desktop, other than an optional SSD upgrade, the only other thing you need is a GPU. To pair with an older Intel i5, an appropriate budget would be around $150 or so, and there's honestly 2 pretty solid options at that price point. The card I went with is this Asus Dual RTX 2060 Super, so despite the total bill being $300, we're still getting some first-gen RTX action inside of here. Keep in mind, we won't actually be enabling ray tracing, but the RTX GPU is still a welcome sight. I sniped this on eBay for $140, but honestly, I wouldn't even consider it a snipe all that much because you should be able to find a similar price card if that's what you're looking for. I did come with another option though, just so you can see multiple benchmarks, and this here is an RX 6600 XT, which will work as well. This one cost me $165 on Java, and that's priced pretty well because this should outperform the 2060 Super by a little bit. Both of these cards work with our PSU and only require that one external GPU power connector. If you didn't use that power adapter, again, you'll be limited to something like a 1650 or 3050. Both of those are significantly underpowered compared to these 2 options, so that's why I think it's worth going down this route. One other thing to be aware of is that in some games we might see a slight CPU bottleneck. Depending on which CPU model you go with, the performance of that could hold back these GPUs by a bit. In my opinion, if you're spending $300 on a gaming PC, it's a little valid to not have a perfectly balanced system. Just know that if you eventually upgrade a 2060 Super to an AM4 based platform like a Ryzen 5 5600, you'll get much better performance. With that being said, here's what the final parts list is looking like, and if you consider the 2060 Super my main choice, the total cost is right at that $300 target price. Keep in mind that the 6600 XT would put you slightly above that, but we'll see why that's worth it in the benchmarking section. Before we run those though, let's talk about the aesthetics real quickly, even though this part of the video is entirely optional. I have a feeling that most people interested in a $300 gaming PC don't care at all about the aesthetics, but for the few of you that have that aesthetics over everything mindset like I have, here's what I did to today's build. I first started with removing all of the panels that I could and then just painting them white. I've done this in a ton of other videos. Like I say in all of them, I just used this typical Paint Plus primer spray paint that I found at Home Depot. This time I went with the semi-gloss white option, and the important strategy is to make sure that first coat of paint looks like this. You only ever want a 50% opacity at max, and then fully let that dry for about 10 to 20 minutes. That'll give the paint a perfect sticky foundation so the rest of the coats sit on there real nicely and it doesn't get runny. I ended up spraying about 7 full coats on this thing with 20 minutes in between. You definitely don't need that many coats to get 100% opacity, but I like making the paint thick on there just in case it gets dinged up. Honestly, you probably should also apply a clear protective layer after all of this. I always forget to do that, but I'm sure that would help a ton. Once the paint was on there, then I asked my wife to help me out with her Cricut machine, and she came up with this little futuristic circuit board design. She actually does other more advanced vinyl work like on our Voyager PC on zttbuilds.com. A project like this is light work for someone like her, occur, but personally, I would have no idea how to use that machine. Again, feel free to completely skip this step if you want to. I just like making my builds look a little bit unique so they're fun to look at on camera, but this PC would obviously still run perfectly fine with the exact same performance if you didn't touch the aesthetics at all. And speaking of which, let's finally jump into that benchmarking section. We'll start with Arc Raiders just to prove that this older and budget PC can still hang with the latest titles, at least the optimized ones, because here in 1080p with medium settings, it cranked out a pretty respectable 99 FPS. Just for a quick comparison, that does jump up to 114 FPS with the RX 6600 XT. Next up, we have Cyberpunk, which is a bit more demanding to run, but that didn't stop this build from getting an average of 84 FPS in 1080p medium, and then that jumped up to 90 FPS with the 6600 XT. Here's Marvel Rivals getting 102 FPS and 103 FPS in 1080p with the lowest settings with the 2 GPUs. That very well could be a slight CPU bottleneck though, because as you can see, that CPU load percentage is up there close to 100%. Not a huge deal when you're cost saving this much, but that definitely could be a factor depending on the title. For most of these games, the RX 6600 XT was better by about 5 to 15 FPS, so I would indeed consider that extra amount of money worth it, but even if you stick to the cheaper RTX 2060 Super, everything is at least playable, as you can see with all these benchmarking numbers. We uploaded a full benchmarking run video so you can see the gameplay clips of all these different games. That's over on the ZTT Extras channel, and feel free to subscribe over there because we post a ton of other useful PC building videos as well. But yeah, overall, I'm really happy with how this build turned out, especially for this price range during all of these shortages. I absolutely do not think this meta will last for much longer because those OEM desktop sellers will start to appropriately price them with the RAM and SSD shortages. Enjoy it while you can, and if you want to see a different way that I converted one of these office PCs into a gaming PC, check out the video that's up on the screen right now.